Hey everybody, Antonio here with my review of Insieme, Opera Duets, which was released from Sony on October 7, 2022. The baritone was Ludovic Tézier, the tenor was Jonas Kaufmann, the conductor was Antonio Pappano, the orchestra was the Orchestra dell'Accademia Nazionale di Santa Cecilia di Roma, and the works performed were Giacomo Puccini's La Bohème, Amilcare Ponchielli's La Gioconda, and Giuseppe Verdi's Le Vepre Sicilian, Don Carlos, La Forza del Destino, and Otello. Much like I have been rather critical of listening to Jonas Kaufmann these days, I've been just as critical as I was listening to Ludovic Tézier as a baritone. Sure, once upon a time, he was a fine lyric baritone, especially in roles such as Count Almaviva from Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro and Ambroise Thomas' Hamlet. However, when he started singing more dramatic baritone roles such as Rigoletto, Amonasro, and Don Carlo de Vargas, there were certain habits that he was developing just for the sake of wanting to sound more dramatic, i.e. sounding throaty, let alone sounding really barky in certain passages, thus kind of putting a damper on his natural lyric baritone voice. And that is quite a shame because Ludovic Tézier did possess one of the finest instruments I've ever heard from a natural lyric baritone. In his glorious prime, his emission was admittedly more smooth, as well as a lot clearer than his tendency to bark and sound throaty just for the sake of sounding big and dramatic. Sometimes his performances of Rigoletto, Amonasro, Conte di Luna, and Carlo de Vargas do leave a lot to be desired, considering that he doesn't really have the appropriate amount of beefiness, meatiness, darkness, roundness, and richness like a true baritone, let alone a whole ton of squillo just to make his voice a lot more sizable. And the occasions where he attempts to sound big do come off as hit and miss due to his barkiness and due to his throatiness. However, much like my listening experience with Jonas Kaufmann, the reason why I keep coming back to Ludovic Tézier is because he has one asset that I continue to admire, let alone continue to adore in Monsieur Tézier, and that is his tall, elegant, and dashing stage presence. In fact, his said stage presence is also put to fine use in what has to be one of my favorite roles that I've been listening to him thus far, which was Rodrigo di Posa from Verdi's Don Carlo. Cavalier baritone roles such as Rodrigo di Posa from Verdi's Don Carlo, let alone Marcello from La Bohème, fit him more like a glove rather than the beefier, meatier, bigger roles such as Don Carlo de Vargas, let alone the villainous roles such as Scarpia from Tosca. If I were to take away any issues that I've had with Ludovic Tézier away, he is still a fine singing actor who can be good in certain cavalier baritone roles, let alone roles that call for nobility and call for elegance and stylishness. And when he joins forces with Jonas Kaufmann, they can actually prove themselves to be pretty good together, even with their vocal faults. Granted, Jonas Kaufmann's throatiness and woofiness cannot be ignored, especially when he tries to do heavier, more dramatic roles, such as Otello, Don Alvaro, and Radames. And Ludovic Tézier, despite his stylishness and despite his elegance, doesn't really have the appropriate heft for singing all of these bigger, beefier Verdian roles such as Don Carlo de Vargas, or even more villainous roles such as Iago and Scarpia. Nevertheless, the strengths that both of them have together in their duets are found in their fine vocal chemistry, where they're able to use the best assets of their voice and work off of each other exceedingly well, such as Kaufmann's virility as well as singing his lines with abandon, and Tézier's stylish elegance despite his voice being a tad bit light for these beefier roles. And it is quite surprising to know that when listening to all 9 tracks, Kaufmann did sound a lot darker than Tézier could ever sound like despite being a tenor. From the Verissimo scene in La Bohème by Giacomo Puccini in un coupé, all the way up to the scene between Barnaba and Enzo, Principe Enzo di Santafior from La Gioconda, and even the scenes in duets from Verdi's Le Vepre Sicilien, Don Carlos, La Forza del Destino, and Otello. There was no doubt that the hard work and diligence both Ludovic Tézier and Jonas Kaufmann managed to put together in this album managed to be on full show. Even with their vocal shortcomings, i.e. Kaufmann's throatiness and Tézier's tendency to bark, as well as his thinness, they're still able to produce fine vocal chemistry and work exceedingly well off of each other and just have a blast. I would even argue that their strongest moment together was in un coupé, in which Jonas Kaufmann's natural lyric tenor voice and Tézier's natural lyric baritone voice managed to make the roles of Rodolfo and Marcello come to life. Yes, Kaufmann's Rodolfo doesn't have the natural sheen, let alone the absolute brilliance that defined the likes of Giacomo Laurivolpi and Gianni Raimondi. And yes, Ludovic Tézier may not have the roundness and richness that defined Giuseppe Taddei and Gian Giacomo Guelfi. But both Kaufmann and Tézier managed to do fine jobs all the way through, respectively as Rodolfo and Marcello. Even the two duets from Verdi's Le Vepre Sicilien were quite nice to listen to, despite Kaufmann not possessing that naturally bright, ringing tone full of sheen and clarion high notes that are necessary for Henri or Arrigo in the Italian version. And I also have to applaud their rendition of Rodrigo's and Don Carlos' duet in Verdi's Don Carlos, which they managed to do quite well. And even though I do take issue with Ludovic Tézier not sounding as beefy, let alone as dark, round, rich, powerful, and strong that he needs to sound like as Don Carlo, let alone as incisive and biting as Iago, I could still give Monsieur Tézier some credit for at least finding some shading as well as some character in both roles. For Don Carlo de Vargas, he at least does his best to sound as furious and rage-filled as possible, especially when he's confronted by Alvaro's real identity in Invano Alvaro. And he was able to play up Iago's duplicitous nature in Era la Notte from Verdi's Otello. And yes, in terms of Kaufmann as Don Alvaro and Otello, yes, he does tend to use that signature throatiness that unfortunately tries to make him sound big, and also has that effect where he does sound kind of suffocated. But the fact that he was able to tackle both Don Alvaro and Otello head on just shows how gutsy he was from beginning to end. And when all is said and done, these 9 tracks were definitely fine all around. Yes, it would have been just as great to have had a lot more duets featuring Tézier and Kaufmann, specifically the Wolfcrag scene from Donizetti's Lucia della Mermur, especially when Jonas Kaufmann continues to embrace his lyric tenor roots. More appropriately, the velvety and naturally dark lyric tenor voice that Jonas Kaufmann was once very well known for, and that used to be one of his assets before tackling all of these bigger, more dramatic roles. And Ludovic Tézier being in his element with this particular bel canto role of Enrico, it would have been wonderful to have heard their rendition of Au fond du temple saint from Bizet's Le Pêcheur de Perles. And as I stated before, it would have been just as fine to have had both Tézier and Kaufmann, never forgetting their more lyrical origins, especially with these two duets. Nevertheless, despite Kaufmann's throatiness and despite Tézier's thinness, at least they were able to work well off of each other and managed to build up each other quite well all thanks to their vocal chemistry, which made this album surprisingly listenable. And it was also helped with Antonio Pappano's conscientious attention to the music. Yes, he's not really the most exciting of conductors, but he was able to pay close attention to the text and manage to do what he has to do in order to make the orchestra follow well. And at least he didn't go too overboard, especially in terms of mezzofortes, let alone some piano signs, thus showing sufficient nuance, although it is rather textbook. Case in point in In Vano Alvaro, where after Alvaro ends up having his outburst of umbrando, normally you would have expected the orchestra to just swell a lot more, but something felt like it was clipping those wings to the point where the result was kind of underwhelming. But regardless of that flaw, I still have to commend Antonio Pappano for at least keeping the Orchestra Nazionale di Santa Cecilia together. Overall, if you are a hardcore Ludovic Tézier and Jonas Kaufmann fan, you might owe it to yourself to listen to this album. It's a solid selection of opera duets, and I'm pretty sure that once you listen to it, you would have wanted for a lot more, especially from different composers. Heck, it would have been more fun to have heard them sing something from Donizetti, specifically Lucia de Lammermoor's Wolfcrag scene, or even Bizet's Le Pêcheur de Perles au fond de Templeson, or even something in Russian like the final scene between Onyegin and Lenski. Those would have been wonderful additions to this particular album. However, I digress. It's still a fine and solid listen, especially if you are major fans of both Jonas Kaufmann and Ludovic Tézier. Those who are not huge fans of Jonas Kaufmann or Ludovic Tézier or both might want to look elsewhere, especially when it comes to real singing. But I'm pretty sure that those of you who are fans of both Kaufmann and Tézier might want to give it a listen. When all is said and done, I give Insieme opera duets 4 out of 5 stars. Real music fans and real fans of good singing might end up looking elsewhere, but for those people who enjoy Jonas Kaufmann, Ludovic Tézier, or both, might enjoy this, especially with the fine and solid selections of opera duets from Puccini's La Bohème all the way up to Verdi's Otello. And of course, Antonio Pappano's conducting of the Orchestra Nazionale di Santa Cecilia is actually quite solid to listen to. Yes, it may not be the most exciting, but at least it's not boring and at least it's not too underwhelming. He still managed to keep everybody together, and of course, he was able to bring out some really fine moments between both Kaufmann and Tézier to the point where he did contribute quite well with their vocal chemistry. And for those of you who listened to Insieme opera duets, what'd you think of it? Did you feel that both Jonas Kaufmann and Ludovic Tézier managed to work well off of each other in this album? Was there a particular duet that you enjoyed the most, whether it be from Ponchielli's La Gioconda, Puccini's La Bohème, Verdi's Le Vêpres Siciliennes, Don Carlos, La Forza del Destino, or Otello? Did you also feel like there should have been a lot more duets in this album, especially suitable to their voices? Or did you feel like this album was rather underwhelming? Please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it for my review of Insieme opera duets. Tune in later for my review of Puccini's Turandot, specifically the album version, starring Sandro Ivanovsky as Turandot, Ermon Lelyaho as Liu, and of course, Jonas Kaufmann as Kalaf. So until then, good night everybody.